When I began thinking about what I would talk about this morning, I realized we were not only approaching the threshold of a new church year, but a new school year, and really who knows what else. We're at the threshold of change. Students are beginning school again, and next week is ingathering and our water celebration. The Latin word limen means threshold, and according to Father Richard Rohr in our second reading, liminal space is an inner state and sometimes an outer situation where we can begin to think and act in new ways. While it hasn't been really obvious every week because of holidays and such, our theme this past year has been roots and branches. The theme this month is seeds, and so I titled this sermon, Seeds of Change. I went back and reread several sermons I had previously done about thresholds and change. Both times I had delivered them to congregations who were in the process of calling a new minister, a big time of change and uncertainty for their churches. I talked about how to make the most of that liminal time, that time between ministers. I begin with the analogy of a physical liminal space. A layover at the airport, a place you're passing through on your way somewhere else, like a hallway, a staircase, or that space between the automatic doors and the exterior doors at H-E-B where the ice machines are. I then suggested that they use that liminal time productively, getting ready for the new minister, which highlights the fact that there are two types of liminal space, physical and psychological. Now, while the foyer you pass through into the sanctuary is lovely, I'm less interested in dwelling on or in physical liminal spaces, be they foyers, airports, or H-E-B, and will focus on the psychological ones. Psychological liminal spaces are more emotional and less tangible than physical ones, and may be seen as more of a life transition or a shift between two ways of thinking. And because of this, psychological liminal spaces are often referred to as liminal states. This differentiation recognizes the mental aspects and often the challenges that are involved with being mired between spaces. Now, according to experts, psychological liminal states are further divided into two states, emotional and metaphorical. Emotional liminal states often accompany life transitions or milestones. From an emotional perspective, a liminal space describes the time between the ending of one part of a person's life and the beginning of the next phase. So examples include a breakup, retiring, or the death of a loved one. I've been witness to several other examples just recently. I moved this summer from my Midtown apartment about a mile east into a condo. A transition from apartment living to home ownership, a new phase for my time in Houston. Another example was last weekend when Conrad's son Harrison got married in Dallas. I was honored to have been asked to perform the ceremony of my stepson. There are currently profound changes and liminal states for Harrison. He got married to his high school sweetheart, and they will soon be moving out of state for work. Harrison was just in junior high when I met him. I would pick him up from school, and I helped teach him to drive. I introduced him to the joys of cooking. I coached him for his interview for a magnet school. Events such as a wedding not only lead one to anticipate future change, but cause us to reflect on how much things have changed. And some of you may be in the same sandwich situation as Conrad and I. The kids are barely at the door, and our aging parents are needing unanticipated levels of care, which of course changes both their lives and ours. Now, the second psychological liminal space is metaphorical, which means it is literally in our mind, which is not to dismiss it. It can be as stressful, if not more so, than the emotional milestone type. Because in this type, there's usually an important decision of some type to be made. Examples that pop into my mind are choosing which college to attend or deciding whether or not to accept a job offer. And until that decision is made, a person can be bouncing around in a state of liminal uncertainty, and the stress can just amplify the uncertainty. I've told some of you this story. I was trying to decide whether or not to go to seminary, and I was anxious. I was in that metaphorical liminal space. Conrad made the decision easier because he's so incredibly supportive. But I was older than most of the other students' parents. I thought, doing research, writing papers, reading those stacks of books, can I even do that again? Then I remembered, I was an art major. I never did that the first time. As Richard Rohr said in our second reading, the very vulnerability and openness of liminal space allows room for something genuinely new to happen. Liminal space is where we are most teachable, often because we're most humbled. He continued on, it's no surprise then that we generally avoid liminal space. Much of the work of authentic spirituality and human development is to get people into liminal space and keep them there long enough that they can learn something essential and new. But we avoid it because change is unpleasant and difficult. Even when we know we're not in a good situation, it's often easier to deal with the known than the unknown. I stayed in a relationship for years after it was over just to avoid the difficult change. Years later, I wondered, stay in my job, which grew less and less satisfying, or go to seminary, which would be more work, less money, and far more unknowns. Now, one of my fellow students in seminary was Tim Schaefer, who is now a pastor at the First Baptist Church of Madison. Now, apparently, Baptists in Wisconsin are quite different from Baptists in the South because Tim is gay. Now, you may not recognize Tim's name or that of his father, Frank, but you might remember their story, which was chronicled in the 2017 documentary, An Act of Love. You see, Frank was a Methodist minister at a small church in Pennsylvania, and he performed his son's wedding to another man in a small private ceremony. You may sense where this is leading. A member of Frank's church brought an official complaint, and Frank was defrocked. Now, I went back and rewatched the documentary this week. I found it on Apple TV. I imagine you can find it other places as well if you're interested. I had remembered an aspect of the story that I believed would help illustrate one aspect of today's sermon topic. While watching, I found myself surprised at how much the movie hit me emotionally and how angry I became at the denomination in which I grew up. I also realized there wasn't just one aspect to the story that I could lift up. It was a virtual smorgasbord of people and institutions in liminal spaces having real difficulty dealing with change. First, this was at the beginning of the controversy over LGBTQ clergy and weddings in the Methodist Church. So, although only 10 years ago, the movie is set in a very specific time and mindset. Because if we jump ahead to this past summer's annual conference, 1/5 of Methodist congregations, more than 6,000, have chosen to leave the denomination due to its mistreatment of LGBTQ members. So, a denomination mired in the status quo and unwilling to change, despite the harm it was inflicting, is the first difficulty with change I want to lift up. Now, while I try to avoid bashing other denominations, I don't see a problem with repeating something a representative said and letting it land where it may. In the documentary, a church official was trying to make the point that their theology needed to be the same across all Methodist churches, that you couldn't have some doing same-sex weddings and some not. Well, I would think it might make sense to have the churches in San Francisco do them, even if the ones in Wichita Falls didn't, but they didn't ask me. No, the official explained that when you go to McDonald's, you know the food will be consistent no matter which clown-infested restaurant you're in. Oh, sorry, those were my adjectives. Now, I question the wisdom of the nation's second largest Protestant denomination wanting to emulate a fast food burger joint, no matter how good their fries are. But again, they didn't ask me. Now, by contrast, Unitarian Universalist churches are autonomous. We don't have a bishop or pope. We have a board made up of people you as members elected. So yes, each church or fellowship can minister to the unique needs of that particular congregation in that particular community. And we have a Channing Hall, not a McCafe. Furthermore, ours is what we call a living tradition, meaning how we interact with the divine, the world, and each other has and will evolve over time. And I would suggest how that ineffable spirit interacts with us evolves. People say God doesn't change, which I don't believe personally. But even if I did, how that entity interacts with her creation would. A parent doesn't interact with their child the same when they're 1 as they do when they're 16, as they do when they're 30. Those who try to make people obey yesterday's rules describing an out-of-date definition of God, despite causing harm, are, in effect, saying that their God is not loving and powerful and wise enough to evolve along with her creation. That, to me, is the real blasphemy, not acknowledging two people's love for and commitment to one another. Have I gone off on a tangent? Back to change. The Methodist denomination did not, and some would argue, does not seem able to navigate change successfully. Well, like I said, change is difficult. Nor was change being met with open arms at the church where Frank served. You see, Frank was growing the church. More diverse people were coming, and a second so-called contemporary service was added. Under his watch, the church grew from 140 to well over 200. Now, change isn't always good, as Mike Miles has clearly shown us. And change isn't always growth, but growth is always change. The two words are used almost interchangeably in several popular aphorisms. Best-selling author Louise Penny wrote, "Life is change. If you aren't growing and evolving, you're standing still, and the rest of the world is surging ahead." I imagine you're familiar with Gandhi's quote, "To be the change that you wish to see in the world." Well, Frank's church was changing, and some people were anxious about the changes, which was understandable. We're all anxious with change. In a liminal space, we're uncertain. We're not in control. We become uneasy. Our minds like regularity and consistency. It wants and creates predictability. Now, I've read that's why children love to watch the same movie over and over, often to the consternation of their parents, because they already know what's going to happen. Spoiler alert, the mermaid gets legs. When the attendance of the contemporary service began exceeding that of the traditional service, longtime members became even more anxious. As often happens, when you're anxious, you're not quite sure why, but you need a place to pin it. People complain that Frank was occasionally late to the second service, that he was unprepared. Then people rallied around a problematic staff member he was considering letting go. That staff member had a son who was a member of the congregation. He was in the military and so was only able to come to services about once a year. 26 days before the 6-year statute of limitations expired, he filed the complaint against Frank. Near the end of the documentary, a congregant says, "Well, they got what they wanted. They're back down to one service, and they don't have to see Frank at church, although he's appearing around the world now and on book covers." The documentary chronicles change within a denomination, change within a congregation, and the poignant, life-changing liminal spaces for the people involved. A very emotional and metaphorical liminal space for Tim, trying to decide whether to come out to his parents. Would they disown him or throw him out? He had a friend that happened to. What would it do to his dad's career? Tim saw firsthand the denomination stand at an annual meeting. Frank, of course, was in a liminal space, trying to decide how or if to defend himself during the trial. His career of over 20 years was on the line. Sometimes we make decisions which lead us into a liminal space, and sometimes we're thrust into that space, whether we like it or not. So, how in the world do we deal with all this constant upsetting of the apple carts? Change inescapably affects all aspects of our lives, personally, professionally, collectively. You may have heard me say, change is inevitable, except from a vending machine. And while it will probably be uncomfortable, the status quo isn't an option. As William S. Burroughs told us, when you stop growing, you start dying. Benjamin Franklin told us, when you're finished changing, you're finished. So how do we better come to terms with change, when so often we'd rather just throw it in a jar on the counter and not have to think about it? Ever striving to be helpful, I looked up a few suggestions. And to be candid, some struck me as a bit Pollyanna-ish. I read that we should accept the transition and be flexible, reframe the conundrum from a negative to a positive. Come on, if I could do those things, I wouldn't be so stressed that I'm on the internet looking for solutions. Some other suggestions I found a bit more practical, at least for me. When we're going through changes, we need to also hold on to things we're familiar with, things that we're used to. I talked about rewatching movies earlier. Maybe reread your favorite book. If you read Carol's message in this week's email newsletter, you'll know she suggested that we participate in rituals to help ground our lives. Rituals connect us not only one to another, but to those things that are meaningful in our lives. And they have a comfortable rhythm and repetition. Now, speaking of connecting with others, another recommended way to deal with anxiety while in a liminal space is to find people who understand and talk to them. My husband's a therapist, and he insists that finding those who have undergone what you are now going through for support is invaluable. It's helpful to put into words what you're feeling, whether with a trusted friend or simply by writing in a journal. Giving those thoughts a place to live can make them feel smaller and more manageable. And by journaling, you might be able to try this next suggestion. Kirsten Franklin, a New York-based mindset expert, suggests we keep asking ourselves why until we get to the bottom of what is causing our anxiety. She calls this going 7 layers deep and offers the following as an example. Why am I so uncomfortable not knowing X? Well, because of P. Why does P make me so uncomfortable? Because P is unfair. Why is P unfair, and why does it, being unfair, really bother me? And so on. Once we find the root cause, sometimes it just goes away and rids ourselves of the emotional impact of that cause. It goes away, and sometimes we need to engage other techniques and practices to rid ourselves of the emotional impact of that cause, she says. The final suggestion I'll talk about is especially important: self-care. When we're anxious, it's even more important to take care of ourselves. Eat right. Avoid clown-infested burger joints. Carol talked about the importance of rest 2 weeks ago. And the last time I preached, I encouraged us to spend more time slowing down and meditating. In my research, I was reminded that physical activity is an important part of self-care. Get up and get moving. Some folks run, some go to the gym, some ride their bike. The point is, don't sit on the couch and let the worries amplify in your head. I know all this sounds like a lot of work. Father Richard may tout liminal space as a situation where we can begin to think and act in new ways. But what if I don't want to? Because it's so hard. Well, because there is no status quo. You're either moving forward or you're losing ground. Despite how incredibly difficult it is to be there, we have no option but to enter into that liminal space. We need to stay until we grow and opt out of our comfort zone. Because if we don't move forward, we will not be who we were always meant to be. We will not be who others depend upon us to be. And we will not be the change that we wish to see in the world. Amen, and so be it.